This is episode 537 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am pleased to be joined by Representative Larry Scott, who represents Southeast New Mexico in the New Mexico Legislature. I believe you're in both Lee and Eddy counties, correct, Representative Scott?
Paul, District 62 is one of the most compact House districts in the state.
Oh,
It is actually concentrated into central Lee County, with most of my constituents coming from the north side of Hobbs.
all right. Well, thanks for that clarification. And again, welcome back to Tipping Point, New Mexico. We've definitely enjoyed hearing your knowledge and your take on the situation in Santa Fe and being a state rep representing a conservative part of New Mexico. We're going to talk a little bit in this show about the prospects for nuclear in New Mexico, as well as the budget situation in the state and prospects for gross receipts tax reform and some opposition that issue has generated in the city of Carlsbad in southeast New Mexico. So let's get started with this nuclear conversation, Representative Scott. I'll tee it up, which is New Mexico's in the midst of this energy transition, thanks to, in part, the Energy Transition Act passed in 2019. That act is part of why New Mexico is getting out of its leases at Palo Verde Nuclear Station in Arizona. But as the discussion over energy and specifically green and zero carbon evolves, there has been an increasing realization, I think, on both sides of the aisle that nuclear could and should be a part of the nation's and world's energy transition, as nuclear is both a good base load sort of power, and it is zero carbon and not intermittent like the wind and solar that so many like to push, including our governor. So as a House Republican, there's been a conversation and even a white paper that has been put together talking about what could happen in New Mexico in terms of nuclear energy. So why don't you take it from there and kind of share where this conversation is in New Mexico, what you think could happen, et cetera.
As a consequence of the history of all things nuclear in the state, nuclear power will have, in the current administration, current legislature, a very tall hill to climb to be considered as a power source. I think ongoing PRC hearings that are about to get underway in the opposition to the continued participation of PNM in that Palo Verde power, I think speaks to that. And New Mexico, with the Trinity bomb site, with the nuclear material mining problems, with the cleanup activities that are ongoing at Los Alamos National Labs, there's just a lot of discomfort with all things nuclear in the state. And I don't see nuclear becoming a big factor in our power generation as a power generation source unless some of those attitudes change.
Now, obviously, New Mexico is controlled by Democrats, and they, at least in New Mexico, currently tend to not support nuclear necessarily, but that's not the same for Democrats across the nation, and an increasing number of environmentalists And of course, it's not the same for Republicans. Now, is nuclear something that the Republican Party of New Mexico and Republican candidates are going to make an issue and talk about from a, both energy availability perspective as well as a green perspective? How do you see this issue, or do you see this issue at all being top of mind for Republicans in New Mexico?
Paul, I can't speak to the party or my colleagues in either the House or the Senate. I will tell you, my personal opinion is that nuclear must become a part of that solution. And the hurdles are not just environmental hurdles. The hurdles are also economic. Now think about this. A nuclear power plant is basically a heat source for a steam turbine. That's what
Right.
generates the electricity. And those plants are designed to operate most efficiently when they're running at very high levels of their design capacity. So a nuclear power plant does not lend itself to being the swing producer, if you will, accommodating the variables of wind and solar. It should be the other way around. That is, wind and solar making up excess demand when the base load nuclear power generation plant can't sustain all of what's being required. But that's not the way we're running the systems. What we're doing now is saying, and this is because of economics, when wind is available, when solar is available, you can put that on the grid for fractions of a cent in some cases. And these baseload plants very simply can't compete from an economic standpoint. So there are a number of issues that will need to be overcome to make nuclear power make economic sense. Otherwise, you're going to be spending a lot of money for power plants that will not run very efficiently if they are modulating their output to accommodate wind and solar.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that, and it's pretty obvious, the nuclear really can be that most baseline, base load power sources because it is so utterly consistent. But New Mexico and the policies that have been adopted in the legislature and the PRC have put so much wind and solar onto the grid and are kind of focused on that. Would you say that at least for the time being, it's more favorable to natural gas? Or where is the grid heading in New Mexico? I mean, ultimately, natural gas is not going to be a part of the equation in the state due to the policies that have been implemented. So maybe nuclear is not viable currently, but if there was a change of mind among New Mexico policymakers, and they decided to abandon wind and solar, maybe that's when we would see a move towards nuclear. Where are we going, and where could we go?
I think the technology may provide some of the solution. And that is, I don't know if you've heard the term small modular reactors.
Yes.
So in that circumstance, rather than have a gigawatt reactor needing to operate at a very high level of efficiency, what you may see in the future are modular reactors, say maybe 50, 75, 100 megawatts per unit, lined up as a series of units that can be brought online or taken offline as a consequence of demand. I think that's one solution to the problem. I mean, what we don't have is a lot of operating experience with this new technology. I think maybe the first one that is scheduled for to go into operation may be in Wyoming, but don't take that to the bank. I think that's something that I've read in my investigations as to the first of these smaller units going into service. But that would be a solution because they're smaller, because they're modular, and because you don't have to have each module running all the time. You can kind of ramp that up, ramp it down to meet demand. Now, in the near term, there is just no substitute for combined cycle natural gas, because you can fire that up and have it online in a very short period of time relative to technologies.
So where do you see things going, given the political climate we're facing, and where Michelle Lujan Grisham and the Democrats want to take us? So are we going to be okay in terms of our electricity generation with the move towards wind, solar, and battery, and away from natural gas? Are they going to have to ultimately go with natural gas at some point, kind of carve it in as California did? Or where do you I know this is punditry, but where do you see things heading realistically right now?
I think wind and solar, and with to a very limited extent, battery backup, will be the order of the day until reliability gets to be an issue. I've made the statement on more than one occasion that the Energy Transition Act would not survive the second brownout. And we haven't had that yet, but we can see on the horizon those circumstances developing as we move more and more to depending on wind and solar for baseload power.
And last question on this issue, that just to clarify, the Republican efforts and kind of the white paper and the focus is on some kind of effort being made in the Four Corners, essentially adjacent or on the same property as the San Juan generating station, because you already have the infrastructure. Now, that's something that gets lost a lot of times until you have a disaster like we had in Maui, or some of the power line issues we had in California, is that this shift to so-called renewables also involves massive rethinking and rejiggering of our electrical grid. You're going to need a lot of new power lines, and of course, having the existing San Juan generating station, lines available would help for a nuclear plant. It could have been used for a major natural gas plant to prop up the renewables, and it's still available. That's still a possibility, but you don't see that happening, I guess, is what I've understood from talking to you.
I don't think so. And to your point, somebody's going to have to build a lot of power lines, and somebody's going to have to pay for those. And I see as a consequence the price of our electrical energy going up to the consumer.
Yeah, and that's something that we talked about when the Energy Transition Act was under consideration in 2019 and ultimately passed, and something that it's eventually going to happen. But for the time being, we're just going to kind of watch and see how reliability goes. Obviously, this summer was the first one since the closure of San Juan Generating Station, and things seem to have been able to work out. But one summer does not a successful transition make.
Paul, in my mind, our utility system ought to have 4 primary factors. And that is that power should be available, it should be reliable, it should be affordable, and it should be environmentally sensitive. And to the extent that our public policy is now putting the finger on the scales of wind and solar that are not the most efficient way to solve all 4 of those problems. We're putting our fingers on those scales, and as a consequence, I think all 4 factors will eventually suffer.
All right. Well, we will wait and watch and continue to be active on these issues, but we're going to leave that topic for now and move to a little bit more of an economic oriented topic, specifically relating to taxation. Rio Grande Foundation has been the organization leading the fight for years on gross receipts tax reform, eliminating pyramiding, and the taxation of business input services. Legislation was introduced, HB 367, which gained the support, at least in broad terms, of the governor, not to mention, broadly speaking, some legislative support. Representative Jason Harper introduced the piece of legislation, but despite this bipartisan support, it wound up really not moving at all. And I want to talk to you about issues in some of these local communities that have made gross receipts tax reform problematic because of the way the gross receipts tax works, and some fixes that you worked on in the legislative session. So why don't you briefly talk about the challenge of reforming the gross receipts tax in the first place, and what your idea legislatively would have done to help some, at least local communities, cope with that kind of thing.
Here, I guess 2 sessions ago, is where the objective was developed to capture gross receipts tax on internet sales.
Yeah, that was 2019 also, HB 6, I believe.
I'm a year off, but I believe that is correct. So I voted against that bill because, in addition to capturing internet sales, it was also a very, very large tax increase during a period of time when state really didn't need to increase taxes. But that said, one of the unintended consequences, I recall this bill was almost 100 pages in length. And as I recall, there was never a discussion of the unintended consequences, impacts of shifting the location of the taxation from the source of the business to the destination where the goods delivered or service provided. Now, as a consequence, what happened in southeast New Mexico was that all of that activity that is out in the middle of the oil field that was taxed because it was being generated by businesses located in Carlsbad or Hobbs, or Lovington, Eunice, now did not get taxed because the destination was outside of city limits.
Can I jump in real quick and offer some background here? So I worked on internet sales tax issues for many years at the National Taxpayers Union, and it was always thought by many that there was some kind of specific exemption or preference given to internet sales, when in reality it was the result of a Supreme Court decision called Quill versus, I want to say, North Dakota, maybe South Dakota, a Dakota. And the Supreme Court basically ruled in that decision that if you didn't have a physical presence in a given state, that you would not be held responsible for collecting and remitting sales tax. And you would think maybe, well, okay, 50 states. I mean, a small business could do that. Well, in reality, in a lot of places, there are numerous tax jurisdictions. You look at a GRT table in New Mexico, and there's dozens of different rates. I forget all the number of jurisdictions, but numerous jurisdictions. Imagine that in a bigger, more populous state, and how many different things you would have to consider. Do they tax this? Do they tax that? So anyway, long story short, when the Supreme Court relented and essentially undermined the Quill decision and said that states could tax internet sales if they did some of these things like destination-based taxation, that was done in 2019. We didn't necessarily need the money as a state. The oil was already flowing in by that time, but Governor Lujan Grisham and the legislature, the Democrats, decided to go ahead and do that as part of a very big, broad bill. A lot of governments do, especially local governments, do credit that law for helping with the revenue picture during COVID because everything moved online. But anyway, I just wanted to give that quick context there as to why this change was actually made.
Okay. Well, Paul, everybody, I think, will agree that our gross receipts tax system is in need of some serious reform. And because primarily it is anti-competitive. Businesses have a harder time with our tax structure here than they do in most other states. Okay. That said, the argument has always been, these gross receipts taxes are funding local needs as one of their primary funding sources. This is where cities get most of their money with. So anytime you talk about, for example, pyramiding reform, to the extent that that lowers the taxes that these folks, for example, the city of Hobbs. The city of Hobbs has services to provide at some cost. And if reform measures reduce that revenue stream, something else has to make up for that. Several years ago, during the Richardson administration, we eliminated tax on food. And many communities have nothing else to tax but a local grocery store. So as a consequence, a number of these local communities had to be held harmless with state funds to compensate for not being able to tax really the only thing they had to tax.
Right.
A better approach would be to tax everything, but tax it at a much lower rate, such that a pair of tennis shoes, for example, was not drawing in some places a 9% tax, where groceries in most cases are not drawing any tax. Make it lower and broader. I think ultimately is the approach that I would advocate.
But you had a piece of legislation that would have, so your bill would have reduced the financial challenge of this particular destination-based tax system
Oh,
on the states.
absolutely. But it wasn't tackling the problem from the revenue side. It was tackling the problem from the distribution side.
Right.
And in effect, what this was trying to do was give back to local communities. That is the Albuquerques, the Las Cruces, the Alamogordos, the Hobbs, the Carlsbads. Some of this excess oil and gas money that now is all flowing into the state, where the state is floating on an ocean of money. We are having a hard time figuring out how to spend that, while local communities and the funds they receive and the services they provide, local communities aren't doing that well in many cases. So what this did was took a portion of that tax that was coming directly to the state, weighted back into those communities by how much they sent up, such that Hobbs and Carlsbad would have benefited perhaps slightly disproportionately because they send so much of that money to Santa Fe, but everybody in the state would ultimately have benefited down to acequia communities. I think that on the distribution side was a much heavier lift because, well, you're going to gore somebody's ox there, potentially. Now, we did have the municipal league participate in putting those spreadsheets together, and they did not actively oppose. There was some consternation about how this would let the state alter those gross receipts coming back into local communities, kind of on a as-needed basis. But a formulaic distribution of those taxes benefiting mostly the folks, I say mostly, benefiting disproportionately the folks that sent the money to Santa Fe, I think is a viable solution to the problem. And we got a little traction. We didn't get through the first committee in the last legislative session, but I'm hopeful that we'll be able to bring that up again in the 30-day session.
And that kind of shift could maybe reduce the opposition of these local communities to reform to the GRT that would, like the grocery tax issue, have an impact on those local government budgets. You know, when you cut the rate at the state level, it doesn't really do anything to the makeup of the tax, and those local governments aren't impacted. But reforming the tax would indeed have some negative consequences for local governments. And I don't think there's any appetite for the hold harmless that we saw with the Richardson era tax shift on groceries. But it would seem that maybe there would be some wiggle room to engage these local communities to get them to relent in opposing gross receipts tax reform. Do you agree with that?
I think with the appropriate safeguards, I would not be averse to voting for taxing everything, food included. Well, again, with the appropriate safeguards to keep our low-income population protected. But at the end of the day, a low tax rate with a broader tax base I think is generally a better idea. Now, don't think, although it's possible that this lake distribution idea could be a part of that conversation. I'm not sure that there would be a comfort level in the legislature with making that happen all at once.
You're talking about the tax reform of the gross receipts?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, this is the challenge and the problem of the of that tax in general. It is complicated, and that makes pulling it out by maybe not the roots, but at least getting it into a manageable situation is such a challenge, because it is so complicated. And when you kind of move one, it's like playing Jenga. You move one of those little blocks at the bottom, and it causes the whole thing to collapse.
That's a great analogy, because in order to lower the tax rate and broaden the base, somebody's ox will get gored because they are now not taxed at all and
Right.
will be at some lower rate if this comes to pass.
Yeah,
Now we're talking about the reform.
right. But the gross receipts tax is really the, as I say, the original sin of New Mexico tax policy, and it needs to be addressed. And unfortunately, it's not an easy process. So with that all being said, let's shift the conversation one more time to the kind of budget situation that the state has. Again, yet another massive budget surplus, thanks to the industry which you're involved in, both from a personal perspective as well as the region you represent, which is, of course, oil and gas, on top of a massive increase in government spending last year, in excess of $1 billion in new spending, thanks to a $3.6 billion budget surplus. Factoring in that spending increase last year, now we have a $3.5 billion budget surplus facing the states and you, the legislature, when the session rolls around in January. Let's kind of tackle this with both your being a representative, as well as from the punditry perspective, and predicting a little bit about the future. Where do you see this conversation going in terms of the budget surplus?
I think we'll increase spending again.
Well,
I mean,
I think, I think that's a safe bet.
Several years has been double-digit increases. I don't see any reason why that won't continue. My problem is we're not getting any bang for that buck. We are increasing spending for the sake of increasing spending, and New Mexico still ranks dead last or near dead last in all of the yardsticks that we, education, quality of living. I mean, as you go down the list, we're not getting much for our money. We need to be spending that money smarter, not in larger volumes.
Well, I think we agree on that. How would you like to see those dollars spent? And more realistically, how do you think they will be spent?
Oh, good question. I think there will be a movement to get more money back into the pockets of New Mexicans. I believe there will be a pretty concentrated effort to lift up those at the very lower end of the socioeconomic scale. Again,
whether that's effective or not is a whole different ball of wax. We've seen a lot of policies geared towards low-income New Mexicans that haven't exactly paid off in great improvements for those folks.
I completely agree. And we have a very low labor participation rate in this state. I think it's among the lowest in the country. At the
Yep.
same time, we have the most generous benefits. And this was an LFC study that was done 2 years ago, I believe, that said a family of 4 participating in all of the programs that New Mexico had available. This was subsidized housing and Medicaid and SNAP and child. The equivalent revenue stream for that family with one minimum wage job was $104,000. And it shouldn't be any secret why we have help wanted signs hanging on every fence in front of every business in this state, because those benefits are very generous. And in many cases, it doesn't pay to work.
No doubt about it. So that's money, good money following bad that, if anything, actually winds up harming the people it's intended to help. Let's talk about tax reform in that context, not gross receipts tax reform, which we just discussed, but what ultimately happened in the legislature last session, and then the governor vetoing all but a small fraction of that. But there were, in an environment with a $3.6 billion budget surplus and rapid spending growth, et cetera, there was a push to increase taxes, including on tobacco, including on capital gains, including corporate income, including alcohol as well. And I've talked
income tax rates.
Yeah, well, that didn't make it into the bill, but there was indeed a push, as you say, to do that. What I would see, if I'm a betting man, and I'll let you agree or disagree with this, if I'm a betting man, I think the governor might come in with a substantial reduction in the GRT, could be as much as a percentage point, and pairing that with a handful of tax increases on the things that we just mentioned that were considered for increases, and ultimately put into that spending bill. I could easily see something like that makes it very difficult for people to vote against that one way or the other, because it would have a substantial reduction in GRT rates, not reforms like we want, but the rate reduction. Do you think that might be where things head, or if not, where do you see possibly things going in the next session?
No, I see that as a very realistic possibility.
Okay, that's where I'm at, and it'll be interesting. I mean, that's obviously a tough discussion. We have zero details on this at this point, but there's definitely a political push for alcohol increases, tobacco. We'll see if capital gains and the others make their way in. I sincerely hope personal income tax is not considered, because that's the exact opposite of what we should be doing. But it wouldn't surprise me if even a rate increase on personal income tax made its way into a tax bill. But anyway, so any other thoughts on that? We're getting down to brass tacks here in terms of time, so I want to give you a chance to say anything else about issues moving forward.
The last few years have seen us pass what I would call omnibus tax packages.
Yeah.
And my mantra has become beware the unintended consequences.
Right.
Because these omnibus packages don't vet, I think, on the floor of the House and Senate, all of these consequences adequately. Now, many of these would not stand up to individual scrutiny, I don't believe, if they were considered outside of the bigger package. I would like to see more of that happening rather than less, so that these tax reform uh, get vetted in many cases as the tax increases that they actually turn out to be.
Right. Yeah, it's a wild process, having watched it, especially last session, where it was clear that the right hand and the left hand did not know what they were doing. And by that, I mean the governor and the legislature did not seem to be on the same page. They wind up passing a very ambitious 37 provision tax omnibus bill with a lot of provisions in there that clearly were half baked. To her credit, the governor vetoed a lot of them. I think she could have done it in a better way from a free market perspective, but she got plenty of criticism from her political left as well. And here we go into a 30-day session where I think some of the same forces will be acting, and we'll see if the governor and the Democrats get their messaging and views straight. But we're going to have to leave it here. Representative Scott, any way people might be able to contact you if you'd like them to contact you, and any other things you want to share real quick here?
My legislative email address is published. My cell phone number is 57390-9065. They're welcome to call.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time today, and look forward to seeing you up in Santa Fe, and hopefully we'll have better news than we expect. But I do fully expect that there will be some reduction in taxes. It's just a matter of whether it'll be overall good economic policy. So appreciate your time today, and we'll talk to you again.
All right. Thanks, Paul. We'll see you.
All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.